This is a national security briefing, Antifa, to designate or not to designate. That is the question, with Intel expert and CIN director Ryan Mauro and Clarion project director Richard Green. And a couple of house rules, if you will, for the event. If you don't mind, please keep your audio muted and your camera off during the program. And if you have a question, please do type it into the chat box, if you would, and then we'll do our best at the end of the program to go over everybody's questions, try to get as many of them answered. I know Richard and Ryan are going to be very generous with their time, so hopefully we get plenty of questions. And other than that, enjoy the program, everybody. So a little bit about our two featured guests tonight. Richard Green is the executive director and co-founder of Clarion Project, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to educate Americans about issues of national security. Clarion Project is primarily focused on the urgent threat of radical Islam. In addition, in 2017, Mr. Green founded the Clarion Intelligence Network. Through his work with CIN, Mr. Green has become recognized as a national expert on Islamic terror activities, frequently consulting with law enforcement officials and presenting national and regional security briefings to select audiences. As an organization, CIN has played a substantial role in domestic terrorism cases, including the recent high-profile raid on a New Mexico jihadist camp that was training young children to perform school shootings. That's pretty crazy. By funding nationally acclaimed documentaries that have been viewed by over 120 million people, providing high-traffic news and information websites, and supporting domestic counter-terror activities, Clarion Project is helping Americans understand the realities of the current situation, a reality that mainstream media is not adequately conveying. So true. And our other featured guest tonight, joining Richard, is Ryan Mauro. He is the director of the Clarion Intelligence Network, a group that tracks extremist activity throughout the world and regularly provides information to law enforcement and policymakers. Though primarily focused on Islamic extremism, Mauro's work at CIN includes providing intelligence on left-wing and right-wing extremists, such as anarchists, white supremacists, communists, cults, and hostile foreign influence operations. Mauro was an adjunct professor for 6 years at Liberty University and Regent University, teaching Homeland Security and counterterrorism, and he has instructed hundreds of members of law enforcement, the intelligence community, and also the military. In addition, Ryan has made over 2,000 media appearances on media networks, including frequent appearances on our favorite Fox News channel, and has been widely published and quoted by numerous mainstream publications. Mauro's work has also been referenced in the House of Representatives and the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Ryan frequently advises U.S. government agencies, counterterrorism personnel, policymakers, congressional offices, and political campaigns for both major parties. Gentlemen, really appreciate you being here. Without further ado, please take it away.
Richard is muted.
Yes. Hey guys. And Benji, thank you for the very kind introduction. I do want to correct one thing, that Ryan founded the Clarion Intelligence Network with me. So that is a bit of a mistake, and I would hate to be credited with something so big without giving him the proper accreditation. So I'm going to just be asking Ryan a few questions. After I ask him some questions, I think that everyone is going to, I hope that everyone will appreciate, we'll break out into a Q&A, and you can go ahead and text your questions via the Zoom line. So the first question, Ryan, I know you have followed extremism for a long time, radical Islam being perhaps the types of extremism that you had begun most strongly researching, but I also know that you have taken a special interest in Antifa. Can you tell me a little bit, what is Antifa, and is it an organized group?
Sure. So I actually started studying communist type groups and movements before I got into Islamic extremism. And it just inevitably led there because the communist bloc was supporting radical Islamic forces. And so that's how it progressed. But Antifa, I think most people know this by now, what it stands for is anti-fascist or anti-fascist action. So they take on the cloak of fighting against fascism, dictatorship, white supremacism, and then more broadly, they'll include homophobia, Islamophobia, hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity, all of those key social justice warrior terms And altogether, basically what it amounts to is they are waging a war on basically everything, any type of power structure. So that's the rhetoric, but how do they get to that point? Well, it's because the center of their ideology is anarchist and to some degree communist. Many of them, maybe most, will identify as communist, but their ideology is more so based in anarchism. They believe that you have to dismantle the state. They don't believe in the nation state at all or citizenship. They want a global non-nation state. And then the vision for what replaces those power structures is articulated as a form of communism, which is itself, of course, a powerful power structure. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They believe that civilians can somehow govern themselves in the aftermath of burning everything down. And this is not my description or insulting of them because I don't like them. If you look at how they were started by the Soviet-backed Communist Party in Germany. And they were a paramilitary criminal force right from the beginning. They attacked liberal democratic forces as well as Nazis. Of course, they only talk about their fighting with the Nazis. And if you look at their Facebook pages, you look at their literature, it's all openly, unequivocally anarchist, communist, anti-American. There isn't much effort put into deception or trying to come off as a mainstream force, which is why it's so disappointing to see how much success they've had at becoming normalized because they haven't even tried to be normalized and to be mainstream. They emphasize that they don't necessarily desire having the majority of public opinion on their side. They are prideful about the fact that that's just kind of a side consideration for them because that's, again, the thinking of an election. Oh, you need to win the majority. For them, well, they oppose the power structures, so that doesn't really matter. Their activity, most of it actually is non-violent, but I would still describe it as terror because you're terrorizing people that you disagree with. And yes, it'll include white supremacists, but who they describe as white supremacists includes everyone that isn't them. And it can include progressives, liberals, anyone who isn't them. But their primary target will be white supremacists because they get the most juice out of that. But they've gone after Clarion Project. And what they'll do is they try to dox you. They try to get your personal information, release it onto the internet so that your safety is jeopardized. At the very least, your privacy is jeopardized. But the idea, and they'll say this, is to jeopardize your safety. So it's not directly violent, but it is providing logistical support to violence. And what they call this is collective self-defense. So when we think of self-defense, we're thinking someone attacks me, me and my friends, my family might defend me to stop the attack. What they argue is that collective self-defense can include violence against nonviolent actors because their rhetoric it causes as much damage as actual violence. So in their mind, if you are a nonviolent white supremacist, the damage that you are causing with your organizing and your speech is equivalent to violence. Therefore, they are justified in doing collective self-defense and coming and attacking you.
Well, that's very interesting.
Basically, what this comes down to, in the most normalized mainstream way, is cancel culture. We're talking about cancel culture as if it's this natural phenomenon. No, that is Antifa having success and other people grabbing onto it, maybe not necessarily understanding that that's an Antifa generated trend, but that's what it is. They want to make their enemies unable to operate in the free society and make you, as much as possible, not exist, destroy your life, and make it so that you may have the right to speak, but you are unable to actually exercise it.
That's very interesting. Now, are they in an organized group? We hear so oftentimes that they're not. It sounds to me from your answer that they must have some level of organization.
Sure. They are very decentralized, and because they have ties to other groups like the Socialist Democrats of America, the Industrial Workers World, they'll have primary affiliations with communist, anarchist, far left groups. I don't even know if you could accurately call them far left, but they operate under all of these different names. And then when they describe their overall mission, Antifa is kind of a shorthand. So you run into this problem where if you were to say, well, let's go after the organization of Antifa, in many cases, people are active in Antifa, but they aren't members of it. It's like a brand. But increasingly, you are having chapters, including on college campuses, that use the Antifa name as it's become more popular. So Antifa started in the United States as anti-racist action. And then they didn't actually form an organization officially called Antifa until Rose City Antifa formed in Portland, and that was in 2007. So that's kind of how they organize things. It's very much internet based. It is international. It is through other names and organizations. So for example, in Texas, there's something called Central Texas Anti-Racist Action. That's Antifa. They identify as Antifa, but what's the name of the organization? Central Texas Anti-Racist Action. The Dallas-Fort Worth Antifa League has 1,100 followers on the internet. You go to their email address though, and it's for an organization called Rise Up. And that's a registered nonprofit, but they can't get tax-deductible donations, so then they send you to another organization in Seattle called Rise Up Labs. So that's where it gets kind of tricky. One other point I would make, just because I want to kind of illuminate how unique this group is that they are not just liberals enraged by Donald Trump, which is what the media likes to make it sound like. Like Antifa is a brand name, they don't really exist, but is because Donald Trump of the Republican Party is driving them to these extremes. Fundamentally not true. They've been acting this way from the beginning. They're just getting more attention now. And if you read their books, they really hate Joe Biden. They hate Barack Obama. They hate the liberals and the Democrats. And as an example, Professor Mark Bray, yes, a professor, kind of put out what you can almost call the modern day like Bible of Antifa. It's called the Anti-Fascist Handbook, which I have right here. Half of the proceeds to the author are donated to an international Antifa organization, the Anti-Fascist Defense Fund, which then has over 300 members from 18 countries. So everyone that buys this, half their money is going right into the criminal organization, the terrorist organization, in my opinion, of Antifa. And Keith Ellison, who has done a lot of messed up things, is now the Attorney General of Minnesota, did arguably the most mess up thing when he basically endorsed this book. He posts a picture of himself smiling with his book about Antifa. What he was doing was distributing terrorist propaganda and fundraising for terrorists. It may not have been illegal, but that's what that action amounted to. And part of the reason, by the way, that Antifa hates the left is, and this is just a really good quote from this book, is that they say the liberal alternative to militant anti-fascism is to have faith in the power of rational discourse, the police, and the institutions of government to prevent the ascension of a fascist regime. So because liberals believe in talking and bigger government, ironically, Antifa hates them because they're anarchists. And that's why Antifa can have gun clubs and then in a way be pro-Second Amendment, which clashes with the left. So it's a really interesting dynamic that you have going on there.
Those, again, great points. Listen, here in Dallas, we knew that. So for those of you who don't know, I did start Clarion. I'm the co-founder of it. However, as well to that, I have moved to Dallas, the Dallas area in the past year or so. So amongst my friends, we had this WhatsApp group, and we actually saw bricks being delivered to different areas downtown that different rallies were going to be using to throw at police officers and whatnot. Now, how do they know when to show up at the same place, and how do they coordinate like that?
That's largely done online. They are becoming increasingly active at college campuses. So you'll have an entire Antifa chapters that are just a Facebook group or a Telegram channel or something like that, and then they can organize that way. And there's just too much communication for law enforcement to monitor at all. In many cases, they they can't monitor it because of different legal restrictions that exist on that. But college campuses this is where it's going to really explode, because Antifa is still a fringe group, but they're coming to the precipice now to where they can become more mainstream and a real force. So I mentioned that the book I was showing before by Professor Mark Bray, the proceeds of which go to an international Antifa group. He is from Dartmouth College. So what's going on in his classroom? There's Antifa chapters opening up on college campuses. The Campus Reform Organization caught Antifa recruiting in a university in Florida. Northwestern University in Illinois, a group that we've exposed for their connections to radical Islam, specifically Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, and having anti-American professors. They have an Antifa professor as well, who endorsed what he called the rebellion against the police. That's advocating criminal activity, by the way, when you do that, and endorsing violence. A professor at the University of Alabama, same thing, was advising people online, giving them tips on how to tear down monuments that they disagreed with. There's actually a group called the Campus Anti-Fascist Network, specifically just for college campuses, created in 2017. So for the first time, the college campus Antifa formed just in 2017. So that shows you how quickly it's growing. But it was founded by a Stanford University professor who taught comparative literature, as well as a Purdue University professor. And when they were confronted about this, they said they only support violence in self-defense. Obviously, they didn't want to say what the Antifa literature says, is that their idea of self-defense includes attacking people who are not violent and not actually attacking you. The other example is Kirkwood Community College had an adjunct professor that's in Iowa who was fired, presumably for openly identifying as a member of Antifa and an Antifa activist. So this is a very serious problem.
Very interesting. We all know how college campus, as goes college campus, also goes society in large part. So what you're saying is so profound. Switching gears a little bit, how does Chaz and Portland fit into this whole rubric?
Well, what you're seeing happening in Portland now is classic Antifa, regardless of whether someone who shows up and engage in those violent attacks is necessarily identifying themselves as Antifa. They might be connected to some other organization that will adopt the Antifa brand. It's a way of describing how you do things and the philosophy that you're a part of for them. And then in some cases, Antifa is an actual organization. But Chaz, to me, was a lost opportunity to damage Antifa, the anarchists, the communists ideologically. Because think about what a disaster that was. In some cases, and I've said the same thing about radical Islamic forces like Hamas in Gaza, it's advantageous to let them take power when they have popular support in some cases. Because then they have to deliver on their promises and you can see what they're about. All the money that they invest in propaganda, if they don't deliver on those promises, might as well just burn it. And so the Antifa types take over Chaz, and what do they immediately start doing? And keep in mind, this is at a point when some liberals, thought that they were the good guys. Well, they immediately started getting guns, forming a security force, while at the same time standing for the abolition of the police and security forces. They set up a border wall, which is something that they say Trump is a fascist for doing, the fascist border wall. But because they're forming their own country, guess what? You need to have a border and you need to have a wall. They were doing surveillance and confiscating people's phones. They very quickly became exactly what they claimed to oppose. And then when the police eventually went in, they just collapsed. You had a recipe for a real disaster there with a lot of bloodshed. But no, they're a weak and bankrupt ideology. And at that point, it became clear. And fairly rapidly, it was dismantled. By the way, part of the reason I believe the police went in when they did is because there were white supremacists aiming to show up and take care of the job for the police, which we were providing intelligence to the authorities on, because that's obviously a disaster in the making, because each one thrives off the other. And so you had a very real scenario where you might have white supremacists, even anti-government militia type people showing up to shoot it out with Antifa. And both sides leading up to when the police went in were sending messages around the country talking about people flying in, buying plane tickets for this grand confrontation that both sides, both the white nationalists, the really anti-government militias, and the Antifa all believe is meant to happen in a good thing, this epic clash. And so that to them, that was a good thing, that was about to happen.
And that's why law enforcement had to go in at that particular time? Was it an imminent type of situation?
They went in just in the nick of time. And I have to assume, even if they didn't publicly say so, I know that the local police knew, the state police, federal, everyone knew that this was about to happen. So I would assume that that was the reason for them just finally saying, okay, we got to just shut this down.
Wow. Okay, so, you know, many of us on this call have heard the name George Soros thrown around in relation to Antifa. Is he involved with Antifa, with their funding? Where does he, what is his involvement in this whole thing?
Sure. So the issue of George Soros has to be handled very delicately and precisely. And here's why. Well, to answer your question, I have talked to people involved in investigations of these types of groups, and they did indicate to me that there was evidence of financial flows going from Soros-backed organizations, maybe not him directly, as well as Tom Steyer-linked organizations, the guy who ran for president, to these types of militants. Now, personally, I have not traced that money. But even if the money is going from one of these dozens of organizations that George Soros has links to, it doesn't necessarily mean he's sitting at his desk and writing a check and saying that, you know, this is not what I want to fund. And there's a risk in oversimplifying this down to one person. Why? Because if George Soros passes away, well, then what good did all that education do? All right, well, he's gone. So now what's operating? What's financing all of it? So it's important to make the case beyond just George Soros. And secondly, I personally have not seen the smoking gun, and I'm not willing to go out there and make an accusation like that without having really solid proof, because then it becomes debunked or it's in a murky gray area. You just did damage to your own cause and helped the other side. And finally, we do have to be aware of how things we say are used by extremists on all sides. So George Soros, when we're monitoring the white supremacist alt-right types, they mention George Soros all the time. If there is a TV or radio segment about him drawing a web, they'll take that segment, they'll take a screenshot from it, slap an octopus with like a Jewish star on it, and say George Soros because he's a Jew. And you don't want to fuel that. And so we have to be aware that on the one hand, you want to say, okay, well, I'm not responsible for what white nationalists or Antifa or any of these crazy guys think. That's true. You're not responsible fully. But if you can do something differently to not help them, then you should do things differently to not help them.
Listen, I've been really curious. The president at one point threatened to designate Antifa as a terrorist group. What good would that have done? And is it still something that he might do?
Well, they are being prosecuted on charges that are not directly terrorism, but most terrorists are not prosecuted for the charge of terrorism. It's usually procuring a weapon of mass destruction, conspiracy to do an act of violence or a criminal act. It's these other terror-related charges without the word terrorism being in there. So there are people connected to Antifa and this whole anarchist movement who are being arrested and prosecuted. And we talked to Andrew McCarthy, who prosecuted the Blind Sheikh, who organized the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And he was describing to us how by building a case, you arrest a few people, and then you can show their conspiracy with other people. You can build out and bring down an organization that way. So that's what's going on. But when Trump was tweeting, hey, we should designate them as a terrorist group, as if like you do that and then they're all just rounded up and gone, that can't happen. There is no domestic terrorism list like that. For us in the non-legal realm, yes, Antifa's a terrorist group, obviously. So is the KKK. So is a whole slew of groups. They are not banned as terrorist groups because the United States does not ban domestic terrorist groups. You are an American citizen. In the course of supporting terrorism, you break a whole series of laws and you can be prosecuted under them. What Trump and some other people have been alluding to is the fact that we have a foreign terrorist organization list that's held by the State Department, and also the Treasury Department has a version of it. And you can designate foreign branches of Antifa. That's what I would urge the Trump administration to do. You can sanction them, you can designate them, and then the reason that exists is because with domestic terrorist groups, we have the legal tools to go after them on American soil. But if they're overseas, you need to have another set of tools because you can't prosecute them. So if you are designated as a foreign terrorist group, someone living in the United States cannot give you material aid like money. You could potentially not be allowed into the country because you're a member of a foreign terrorist organization. If you get into the country, you can be arrested for that. So the foreign terrorist organization list is meant to deal with, obviously, foreign entities, and you can do that with foreign Antifa as a way of crushing the network within the United States. But there is no list, and there should not be a list, of domestic terrorist organizations that you can just ban and then make them go away as if they aren't American citizens.
Very interesting. I'm going to ask maybe one or two more questions, but I see on the right-hand side of our chat, people are asking really fantastic questions.
Okay.
So I'll ask one or two, but then afterwards, let's go to everyone else's questions because they really are, this is a knowledgeable group of people that we're speaking to. Antifa seems to I mean, they have a horrible reputation, do they not? Why would a young person want to get involved with them?
Well, first of all, there is plenty of room to criticize the Democratic Party and the left for not standing against them. I think they equate them with the grassroots, that Antifa is viewed by major forces within the left as being misguided freedom fighters. For much of the left, they will genuinely believe that Trump, the Republican Party, is now fascist and white supremacist. And so when Antifa says the same thing and then they treat them violently as such, there's a big part of the left that's thinking, all right, I may not agree with doing it, but you kind of deserved it. And so there's this muted response to it. And also politically, I think they're scared of offending them because the same people who are willing to go out there and blow things up and burn them and burn places down, those could be grassroots activists. They're naturally very active people. And so I think there's some degree of fear, some degree of respect coming from the left for Antifa. But that's not the entirety. We have to give, for example, Joe Biden credit because he did issue a statement saying that these are anarchists who deserve to be prosecuted. And positive reinforcement is an important thing. You can hate Joe Biden on everything else, vote against him, whatever. But when something positive happens like that, it is important to have positive reinforcement. So I think that's where a lot of it is coming from. One other point I would make, because I think that this, if any of you come across an Antifa type supporter, this can be useful. Point to the other groups that are largely terrorists that they support. So for example, in the book that I showed you before, the Antifa author writes that George W. Bush sold the war in Afghanistan as a crusade for women's rights. Like that's how he described the war in Afghanistan after 9/11. The US was lying about supporting women's rights to justify its war there. You know, it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Al-Qaeda facilitated by the Taliban killing 3,000 of us. No, we're the bad guys. I mean, that's indirect support for Islamist extremism. Because they believe in abolishing the prisons and the police, they'll rally behind virtually any type of militant, anyone that's been locked up, anyone that's being arrested or prosecuted or investigated, and that includes Islamist extremists. And Antifa very often does engage in anti-Israel activity. They claim that they're, staunchly against anti-Semitism. I mean, every Antifa literature says that. We stand against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Yet they're willing to defend the worst anti-Semites coming from an Islamic background. And so you can't make the argument that they're part of the anti-Semitic front. It's just they fight some anti-Semites and then they embrace others. And when they push anti-Israel propaganda, They are pushing anti-Semitism because Antifa really does hate Israel.
So I'm going to go to some of the questions, but I also want to opine a bit on the question that I just asked. I did a lot of, I was really, really involved with the Israel activism community on college campuses. And at what point a branch of a Hasbara Fellowships or an APAC or Stand With Us, any of the organizations out there would become not cool, then they'd lose all their membership, right? So if it's cool to be Antifa, then that's a big problem for us because the cool kids are going to want to do it. And everyone who is on the cares about being cool, which is every college student, they will want to become Antifa too, because it's the in vogue thing. And that is something that we might be, I guess something you alluded to or said basically outright earlier in the conversation, that they're going to kind of really have a very effective year, unfortunately, on college campuses. Would you agree with that?
For sure. And you can prove it empirically just by looking at how they're organizing there. I mean, they're forming chapters there. To further illustrate why they're growing, if you look at the fundamental premises of Antifa, you have to ask yourself, are the premises of Antifa being vindicated by current events? So one of the premises is that fascism is a real threat, white supremacists and all of them. That threat is increasing. So they're able to point to what they would consider to be, lack of action from the right against white supremacists and those types, and use that to vindicate their ideology. And they would also point to that and other things that they don't like to drive home this main point, which is that their main argument is that democracies or the constitutional republic, however you want to describe it, I like constitutional republic, is inadequately prepared to stop fascism. And it only takes a small number of them to quickly spread and take over. And so I think you're seeing collectively across the United States, Antifa and not Antifa, people are losing faith that the United States can survive, that the system that we have created and cherished is fit for today's modern times. And that pessimism fuels Antifa because they can offer and say, look, we've got a better ideology, communism, anarchism, and other groups can do the same thing and say, look, you're disappointed in your ideology. You think it's failing and going to fail even worse. You're losing hope. I have a replacement. And they can grab that. And then even if it doesn't go to that extent, just the mere belief that, look, our free speech and our system is unable to contain toxic influences that could destroy us. Therefore, exceptional measures are necessary for exceptional circumstances. That's kind of all you need to open up the door for someone to then start reading a book like the one I showed you and say, you know what, I'm Antifa. America was good for the past, doesn't work today. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to, and so these questions, let's try to, Ryan, just out of respect for everybody's time, let's try to go through a little bit more quickly.
Sure.
But of course, explain whatever you think is most vital. Sure. So Yuli asks, if the Antifa orgs under the various, basically Antifa is, as you explained, there are many different names for Antifa, many different organizations. Is that by design, or is that something that just happened organically?
It's both. So they initially began organizing under names like Anti-Racist Action because it's fashionable terminology, and that's just what they called themselves. And then Antifa was kind of like shorthand. I'm referring to modern times. Originally, yeah, they just straight used the name Antifa. But then as time went on, different groups started forming with Antifa philosophy, and they picked whatever name they wanted to go by. But now as time goes on, you're having groups explicitly calling themselves Antifa because Antifa is a word that people know. And as time goes on, you're also going to see some smart elements of Antifa saying, you know what, even though that name is becoming more popular, there's consequences to that, so let's use another name. And you'll see that in the literature too. There's back and forth about how aggressive you should be in your rhetoric and at what stage. Certain people you can be more aggressive with your rhetoric and other people you can't. So there's some degree of freedom given to Antifa chapters in regards to how inflammatory the rhetoric can be and to what degree they want to use the Antifa name.
Interesting. So Ken asks, why is it Treasury doing so little to stop the financing? Why is FBI, DOJ doing so little to arrest its ringleaders? And where's the adult supervision? But I think, Ryan, you did mention that they are doing something in arresting the ringleaders. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure. So the way it's working, and you would expect it to work this way, is they arrest the most readily identifiable perpetrators, the people you see on camera actually damaging things. And then from there, you can build out and say, well, who are they in contact with? Where does the evidence trail lead to? And then it can lead to people who are helping to organize, inspire, anything like that. Ultimately, because Antifa as a fundamental concept is criminal, it's not like they take on a positive sounding thing solely like, oh, well, we oppose fascism, and then some people on their own do criminal activity. No, you look at the actual declaration in their literature, they are a criminal organization. They intend to do criminal activity. They meet with each other to plan criminal activity. You can use the conspiracy charge to go after, in theory, anyone identifying as Antifa, in theory. And there are a lot of people being arrested. If you go to like the Customs and Border Protection Twitter, you go to DHS, you go to whatever, the DOJ website, there are a lot of people being arrested. The limits on people being arrested can be due to difficulty finding evidence because they cover their identities, lack of resources because law enforcement, contrary to common belief, does have a severe limitation on resources. So those things are being done. As for action overseas, I'm sure there's a lot going on that we don't know about. The measures I'm arguing for is stuff that you would know about. It has to be done overtly. I hope it's coming, but it hasn't been done yet.
Well, the arrests have already begun, meaning
within
that
the US, right? But
within the US.
designating the foreign organizations, sanctioning them,
Mhm.
that's really what we got to do, because that should be, in my mind, relatively easy to do. But I've talked to the State Department about designating other groups where I thought it would be easy. The evidence is overwhelming. And they'll explain the process and be like, all right, well, you have to allow them to get lawyers to protest, and it becomes a big court battle. And then they get, dissuaded by that. To me, I would rather just designate them. And then if you got to deal with a lengthy court battle, you deal with it then.
So Wolf asks, since Antifa is based on college campuses, well, I'm not sure if that's true, but let's ask the question. Why not curtail federal student subsidies and financing for those universities?
I think a strong argument can be made that first you do have to educate the universities and give them a chance to take action, because most of them are going to think Antifa is just like a hippie group. Or even if they're an anarchist group, you got to allow college students to deal with weird ideas. How many people do you remember from college that would float from communist to anarchist to conservative Republican to liberal? That's what goes on in college. But like I said, Antifa, because it's explicitly formed to commit criminal activity, the argument is exceptionally strong for college campuses to not allow them to do that. So first you have to engage the universities. That's very labor intensive. And then you have to, at that point, you can start exerting pressure. And so we're just in the beginning stages. In fact, what we're trying to do a little bit of, but we don't have the resources to do, is we need to map out all the Antifa chapters, collect the data so that you can go to the universities with these types of facts. And we just don't have enough hands to do it. If anyone watching wants to help us, we'd be happy to collaborate with you, and we would greatly appreciate it, because that's really our biggest weakness right now. It's just not having enough hands. It's not that it's hard to do, just not having enough hands. Interesting.
Krista asks, Dallas, and this I was not aware of, so Krista, interesting information. Dallas judges Clay Jenkins and Eric Moy, who have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, have a 10-point plan to defund the Dallas Police Department. How do you target the Islamo-Marxist enemy without calling these tactics what they are publicly? Abuse of language and abuse of power.
I'm not really I don't understand all the elements of that question. In terms of how do you fight the Islamic Marxists? Well, Marxism I mean, that's in most cases fundamentally atheist. So there's a clash with the terminology Islamic Marxist, but I know what you mean. There are, I mean, if you look at radical Islamic doctrine, jihadist doctrine, whatever you want to call it, like Marxism is written all over it because it influenced, you know, there's a cross-pollination there. So how do you combat them? You can, I mean, exposing them is good. Usually they'll say very offensive, alarming things. They'll be smoking guns. Only fire when you have a smoking gun. Otherwise, people aren't going to listen to you in the future. And you expose them for it. I do not advocate Antifa type tactics like doxing them even. Some people want to go and do that. I think that that's wrong and counterproductive. But you expose it, you document it, and different measures can be done also to take on the jihadist infrastructure in the United States. Like we've advocated designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization, so that then the authorities have the legal basis to go in and shut down their fronts and arrest their members if after that point they continue to support the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's a series of recommendations that we can make in regards to that.
And Krista, just privately, send me whatever information you have that would prove that Clay or Eric have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. You'll get my email from Benji. So Mark Lieberman asks, Antifa's ideology is so illogical that it's hard for me to believe. Well, we kind of already asked this question. Why would a young person, and so we're going to go past Mark's question. And so Wolf asks, Antifa has international ties to French, German, and even Israel, ultra-leftist anarchists. I'll ask that question. Is that true?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That very big international network there. In Europe, it's more cohesive with more direct cooperation happening. But still, increasingly so within the United States, you're going to see an international network. Like this is how Al-Qaeda looked in the beginning, right? It's largely decentralized, and as they get more and more powerful, you start seeing leaders develop, you start seeing links between individual chapters until you have a real physical network, a giant factory essentially for your ideology and your terrorists. So it's just a matter of time. We're already seeing that type of infrastructure come together for Antifa, and they can simultaneously be decentralized on the local level, but become increasingly centralized internationally. You can do both things at once. As for the ideology being illogical, I agree it's illogical. However, I must say, if you read their literature, including that book, which I'm not recommend you buy, maybe get it from a library or just read excerpts online because you don't want to fund this. I have to admit, reading that book, I can easily see why someone would be drawn in by it. The way that they argue against those falsehoods and the leaps in logic is done in an academic tone that is striking. You are able to point to things in there if you have a really keen eye to deconstruct those arguments, but let's not underestimate the power of a well-written book with lots of footnotes and lots of details to convince someone that they're taking up the intellectually superior side.
So it's the classic, you can put lipstick on a pig, right? Yeah. Harry Plus asks, and I think we've been over this a little bit, maybe a more nuanced answer. Antifa has foreign funding sources. What are the implications of it being a domestic versus international terrorist organization? How does this interact with the US policies and become more controversial?
So far, based on what I've seen, it looks like the money flow is going from the United States out. And then, I mean, you don't really need a lot of funding coming from overseas into the United States to do this type of activity, especially if you have diehard supporters who are willing to self-fund. So I don't know. I would assume there's foreign financing coming in, but I want to be clear that I have not yet found it, but I also have not worked 24/7 to actually find that yet. But in the preliminary stage, I mean, I've not found it going from outside the United States into the United States to create Antifa in recent years. The fundraising is going overseas. But what can we do in regards to that foreign element? Well, like I said before, you designate them. The Treasury Department can sanction foreign groups that they can't have access to American bank accounts. It disrupts the finances. It can make it illegal for the money to go from the United States out. You can make it illegal for outside members to come in. You can use links to those foreign groups that are designated, sanctioned, blacklisted as evidence for prosecution and investigations within the United States, because you have to have evidence of criminal activity in order to launch an investigation. It can't simply be, I don't like their opinion. Even though I think you cannot designate Antifa within America as a foreign terrorist organization, there are still plenty of measures that you can take against foreign actors with ramifications here within the United States. And I think if you were to dismantle the foreign network, and this applies to all the extremist groups, I think the groups within the United States over time wither away and die.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, but of course different, because as we were trying to make the Muslim Brotherhood a foreign terrorist organization, we ran into our difficulties. Antifa actually, in their internal doctrine here in the United States, with that book that you had picked up, is already it advises a militant way of overtaking America, which in turn would probably be easier to prosecute, correct?
Correct. They openly engage in criminal and violent activity. I'm not aware of them even ever denying it. The groups like the Muslim Brotherhood have deception strategies. These guys don't have much of it. They might tone down some of their rhetoric and do some things to hide affiliations by forming series of nonprofits and things like that. But they are openly saying, look, we are criminals. We exist to engage in criminal activity, and they are carrying out attacks right now, openly. So far easier than dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Which is, I guess, is somewhat of a positive thing.
In a way, yeah.
In somewhat of a way. So Bill asks, what is Antifa's, oh, I'm sorry, something just happened to my screen. But he was asking what's their, well, I have so many questions popping up now. He was asking what is the difference between what they state their goals are and what their real goals are?
There isn't, actually. The most that might happen is the media might cover Antifa activity within the controversy of the time. So Antifa engages in these attacks in Portland, and it will be framed by others, not Antifa, but the media and others talking about it, as an outgrowth of the debate over police brutality or something like that. But if you look at the online accounts of those engaged in it and what they say, I mean, it's destroying the United States. They don't believe in a nation state, and they believe in abolishing the police and ripping down all the power structures. So there isn't much of a difference between what their goal is and what they say it is. The difference is in how others are describing it. Interesting.
So if you would ask them again, because we're so knowledgeable, or we played that Muslim Brotherhood and on that field so much, we're used to dealing with people who are much actually smarter because they hide their true intentions, where Antifa does not hide their true intentions.
That's correct.
So Joe Woodwell says, what are the most successful countries doing to contain Antifa? Has anyone been successful at all?
Man, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, other countries in Europe and Russia obviously has the benefit of being a dictatorship, so you would expect them to be more successful. Arrest them, but they still thrive. I'm trying to think of an example of them actually, of a country that actually successfully dismantled their network. And I can't think of any. In a way, that's an interesting observation, because what is one of Antifa's main arguments? It's that free societies are unable to dismantle the networks of bad actors because of the freedoms that they have. And yet, and you see that fulfilled ironically in Antifa itself so far. They're a bad actor that's able to exploit our freedoms, and we have been unable to dismantle them. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic there, is that the argument that they use for their very existence, and they argue, join us because you need us in order to fight the fascists, because free societies can't contain them. Well, the same thing can be said about them.
Well, is that your point, or is the bigger point that we are proving their point to be correct, that we cannot contain them?
Yes, right. So by failing to dismantle them, or at least minimize their numbers, you're never going to make them go completely away. You end up vindicating the Antifa ideology, because the idea is that criminal, horrible elements like that can persist, and the free society will unable to squash them.
Mm-hmm. Just because someone just said this, Bader Minhoff was declared illegal in Germany. So I don't know if that's anything to be spoken about, but Wolf did just chime in with that. So I wanted everybody to hear what Wolf had said there. Yeah, listen, it seems as if one thing that we could do for so many extremists is put them on no-fly lists in America, right? Can Antifa even be can an Antifa member be put on a no-fly list?
Sure, and that's an excellent question, by the way, because that's an example of a common sense measure, and we have all these common sense things that we can do, but we generally don't, because we just don't, I guess, think about it. But I am not aware, I'm trying to think of one, of an Antifa member complaining that they were put on a no-fly list. I can't think of an example, but they absolutely could be, by any justification that's used for Islamic extremists to be put into a no-fly list.
But Ryan, of course I agree with what you're saying, but if we're talking about American citizens, wouldn't that be a bit more difficult? Wasn't that the whole issue the Obama administration had in part with Phil Haney's research?
Not in regards to this so much, because American citizens do end up on the no-fly list. It's not many, but they're on there. So you can take that measure, and there's precedent for it. And the argument that Antifa would deploy if we were to raise this issue is they'd say, oh, well, we're not hijacking airplanes or whatever, but they do target industries. And they could easily argue that the airline industry would be, under any standard of Antifa targeting, would be an acceptable target. Plus, if they're traveling internationally, that could be to meet with other Antifa members. So that's a great idea to start adding them to the no-fly list. At the very least, that could help sever some of their ability to organize and to go overseas and that sort of thing. As for what you were describing with Phil Haney, the connection there can be this. Phil Haney, for those that don't know, is a Department of Homeland Security whistleblower who I was very close to. I knew him when he was in Homeland Security, before he was a whistleblower. And he had a lot of files, intelligence files, on radical Islamic groups that anyone with common sense would say, yeah, you should be gathering that data on who the radical Islamic networks are that produce terrorists. Because it's not just about terrorists, it's about identifying them before they commit the act. And those files were deleted by the Obama administration. Initial restrictions did begin under the Bush administration, and that was a major intelligence loss, but it speaks to a greater problem. And this one does apply to going after Antifa or even white supremacists, which is that the authorities have to be very careful about launching an investigation and continuing an investigation based on anything other than evidence of criminal activity and criminal intent. And so I've even encountered this with white supremacists. I mean, if you're a racist, that can't necessarily be the evidence required for launching an investigation and getting someone arrested, even if it's for an unrelated charge. So you might think, okay, well, that guy likes Nazis out there, so investigate him, and then hopefully you'll come across some other criminal charge that you can get him with. It actually doesn't work that way. And I could easily see that same thing applying to Antifa, although with Antifa, it should be, like I said, easier because their purpose is to commit criminal activity. But I also am not fully confident that everyone involved in the counterterrorism apparatus of the US government even understands that.
Wow. So, Ryan, just because I think we can go a little bit over, you said something that came off your lips so easily, but I think the average person who's listening right now doesn't understand. why does the government have to be careful about investigations? Can't they just investigate anybody whenever they want?
That's one of those myths that are out there. Yes, sometimes there can be investigations that happen that shouldn't have happened. But people who do that risk their careers. So if you're a counterterrorism operative, you do not want to launch an investigation that goes nowhere, and you really don't want to prosecute someone that ends up in a not guilty verdict because your evidence was thrown out because of how it was gathered. So there's a fine line between, you can do some like an assessment, some basic research into someone based on a tip, but launching an investigation and then continuing it through stages and then getting things like wiretaps and stuff, you have to have evidence of criminal activity. It cannot be solely based on constitutionally protected activity, even if you find it abhorrent, even if you find it to be a strong indication that they'll commit violence in the future. I mean, to me, someone who loves Nazis, that's a pretty strong indication you're going to commit violence. But it's constitutionally protected free speech activity that cannot be the basis for the investigation and various other measures and the arrest. And so that's what makes it very difficult for law enforcement to go after these ideologically based groups. In addition to that, you do have a lack of resources, and sometimes people are skeptical of the idea that the federal government or law enforcement can lack resources, because we have all seen their budgets, but it's true, they do lack resources. And that's where the role of civilians like the Clarion Intelligence Network is really important, is because we don't have those restrictions. We have a little bit of resources to make a difference. And if we can investigate anyone we want. And so that's where we come in. And that's what we do at the Clarion Project, and my specific division of the Clarion Project, the Clarion Intelligence Network, is we gather information without any restriction. We do it all legally, and then we build cases for law enforcement that oftentimes results in concrete action that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise.
So you're saying, Ryan, that a civilian has more liberties than the government does?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can go into a mosque, synagogue, or church and collect as much information as I want.
Well, perhaps not a mosque, synagogue, or church, but outside the mosque, synagogue, and church.
Well, you can go to any public event. You can collect. There's no restrictions on you as a civilian. You can do anything that's legal in order to do your research and gather intelligence. And there's no restriction on you passing that to law enforcement. So if you know how to do it well and you have good contacts in law enforcement like we do, you can really make a difference by gathering evidence that the authorities previously would not have.
How interesting. How interesting. Yeah, well, listen, this is someone wrote in about investigations being launched, but Kumi was able to do it, whatever. But which is true at the highest levels of power. There are unfortunately some very bad actors. But Ryan, I have to say, from the vantage point of someone who follows this rather closely, and myself, I have learned a lot, and I will tell you the best news that I think everyone should take away is that in understanding how Ryan explained the restrictions of law enforcement, and if there's no credible threat, that there can be no investigation, being that in this Antifa doctrine, they have, fortunately for us, actually decided to put criminal intent into their doctrine. That means they will be a much easier organization to prosecute than a Muslim Brotherhood or many other organizations that might actually have been a little bit more strategic.
Right, and that means that even people that are watching this can reach out to us and help out. And I mean, literally, like, it's so easy that we got a handful of hours from someone once a year. That would make a substantive difference, especially in regards to Antifa, because like you said, it's just a much easier thing to make the case against.
Fantastic. All right, Benji, I hand the ball to you.
Well, thank you guys so much, Richard. Really appreciate it. Ryan, really unbelievable, insightful, and a lot of information there to take in. And just so everyone knows, where can they get more information about Clarion Project, all the different films you guys have done in the past, and tell us kind of what's on the horizon, if you don't mind. And yeah.
Sure. So you can sign up for our newsletter, which is probably the best thing to do because we all know how social media is with their algorithms. You go to clarionproject.org and get our newsletter directly. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all of them, but whether you actually see a post, I mean, who knows? Because that's how Facebook and Twitter is going, which ironically in that book, the actions that they describe needs to be taken for Antifa to win is basically what Facebook and Twitter is doing. So yeah, so the best thing would be to sign up for our newsletter, but obviously follow us on social media as well.
So as well to that, I want to let everyone know that we are making a movie right now about foreign influence on university campuses in America. That was because of a report that Ryan and his associates did. We have over $10 billion with a B from the big five nations, Russia, China, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, coming into our universities in the last 10 years. But it's more than that. You would say, only 10 billion? No, it's more. Because after we came out with our report, they decided to amend their taxes, and now it's up to 17 billion. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. So you have these very bad foreign players who are giving American universities all this money. And I'm curious if it's because they are such good people. If they just want to help us to learn. If it's because they believe in higher education and they understand that American universities are the best in the world at it. Or perhaps it's for other reasons. And if you want to know what those other reasons are, then you'll see it with our next film, Covert Cash, which we're actually right now have a crowdfunding campaign for. Benji, if you want, you could send that out, but every donation is matched. And this movie we can light up the world with because it's important for liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, professors, illiterates to know what's going on college campuses, because as the college campuses goes, so do the country, and we cannot let nefarious players control our destiny.
So true. And to the point regarding the movie, Dallas Youth Conservatives will be happy to do a screening. I know right before COVID hit, we were going to show Kids Chasing Paradise, and we would love to do a premiere screening of your other films or that film as well, because Kids Chasing Paradise looked like it was phenomenal. So
happy to do both of them, Benji. I'm local.
Fantastic. Great. Well, a couple other really quick announcements. As you see on the screen here, our next event coming up, which I'm super excited about. It's actually our first in-person event since COVID began. I listened to everybody's responses. I've taken several polls, and everyone's like, we're ready to get the hell out of the house and go to an in-person event. And I'm so excited to see everybody. It's been way too long. Of course, we're going to do it safely. All of our COVID guidelines are on the event for anyone that wants to take a look at them. So we're going to be totally compliant, very safe about it. But it's coming up on August 6th, which is Thursday, August 6th at 6:30 p.m. The Studio Movie Grill at Royal Lane, Royal and 75. We're going to be having Dr. Rory Lewis. He's actually the Trump AI specialist, strategist, a really deep insider look at the AI, artificial intelligence, what goes on behind the scenes, how we're going to win the 2020 Trump campaign, and how we're going to win the war on Judeo-Christian values, which are really under attack, as everybody knows. So really excited for that. If you haven't already registered, it's only $5. $5 tickets start out. VIP, $20. You can't beat it. Get out of the house, enjoy the company of fellow Dallas Jewish conservatives, and we can't wait to see everybody there. And again, thank you so much, Ryan and Richard. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Y'all have a good rest of your day, and
thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Pleasure.
No problem. Bye-bye.